The island breathed like a living thing. Heat came up through the soles of their boots, and the air stank of sulfur like a box of spent matches left open in the rain. Waves hissed on sand as black as gunpowder. Marines stepped ashore and felt the ground swallow their ankles, a slow grip that promised no easy retreat. They expected pillboxes on the beaches, the sudden flash of muzzle fire, the shriek of mortar from groves of palm. They found wind hot and listless. They found silence that listened back. Beneath them, the volcano was awake, but not in the way maps show. Inside the hills, shaped like a crouching animal mount, Suribachi men had carved roads and rooms, doors and listening posts, a city of stone without sunlight. The island itself was a fortress. On the horizon, ships rimmed the sea destroyers lifting in swells, carriers turning slowly into the wind like patient mills. At noon, a pilot looked down and saw no movement. He could not see what the island actually was, a sealed body, a labyrinth in the lava. It had taken years of fear and necessity to turn volcanoes into weapons. From the Aleutian fog to the equator's blaze, Japan sat in an arc of fire, an empire laid across trenches and calderas, its approaches peppered with specks of basalt and coral. If the United States was coming island by island, the islands themselves would have to fight. The solution was both ancient and new. For centuries, Asia's fortresses learned to live in the earth. In 1944, the island garrisons sharpened that instinct into a doctrine. Do not wait to die on the beach. Vanish into the rock. Reverse the slope. Hide the guns, stitch together tunnels so that a unit can die once and fight twice more. Refuse the glorious charge. Refuse even the idea of glory as a currency. Take the enemy's energy and let it break itself on your silence. The engineers arrived with picks and compressors, with dynamite and chisels, with maps that showed arteries of tuff and scoria, the same way doctors study veins. They came with laborers, thousands of soldiers and conscripts, and men dragged from Korea and China and Okinawa, given shovels and told that the mountain would keep them alive if they learned to understand it. On Iwo Jima, the ground was a mosaic of ash, cinder, and welded stone. It resisted and it yielded as if it wanted to participate. Ventilation shafts, disguised as bushes, rose like periscopes above the slopes. Narrow-gauge rails snaked through galleries where carts hauled shale to the surface by hand. Rooms bloomed underground operating theaters with cement benches. Storehouses stacked with tinned fish and shells. Command posts wired to telephones that would continue to ring even when the roof shook. Over 10 miles of tunnels ribbed the island, linking hundreds of bunkers and concrete teeth that looked like part of the cliff when your eyes slid over them. A door might open to reveal a field gun, monstrous and wordless, that spoke once and then swallowed itself again. This wasn't just Iwo. In the vast crescent of the South Pacific, Rabaul, an old German harbor, nestled in a volcanic caldera, became a hive. Beneath ranges with names that sounded like drums to Vurver, Vulcan, the Japanese garrison dug. Tunnels for hospitals, tunnels for workshops, tunnels like the sketch of a darker city, hidden within the bright colonial streets. Airfields ringed the bay. Anti-aircraft guns crowned the ridges. Deep caverns sheltered barges and trucks when the sky turned to thunder and aluminum. Far to the north, in the Kurils and the fog-bound Aleutians, the earth was new and raw, its bones close to the skin. Kiska and Atu and Paramushir wore their own armor of basalt cliffs and cratered ridges. Here, too, men tunneled. Here, too, the idea was the same. The rock is your armor, the mountain your barracks. If the sea is a moat, then volcanoes are towers. And if towers no longer protect you in the age of the bomb, make them disappear beneath the earth and wait. On Iwo, a general named Tadamichi Kuribayashi walked the black ridges in the night, a man with a poet's ear for silence. He had stood in Washington once and watched automobile traffic in a capital that felt limitless. He understood what was coming. He forbade the grand charge that had bled away armies from Tarawa to Saipan. He sharpened pencils and wrote orders with a twin edge. Let the enemy land, then cost him every yard. Make the island itself your rifle. When you are seen, it is already too late for the viewer. How Japan turned volcanoes into fortresses is not a story of granite and gun ports alone. It is a story of heat and moisture, of stone that sweats and breathes. It is a story of men with lamps on their foreheads, sipping air through filters made by hand wiring telephone lines down, galleries that smelled of sulfur and old eggs, building a machine whose cogs were Ks and whose fuel was time. And it is the story of those who had to take such places, who learned to read mountains not just as scenery, but as intention. On a morning in February 1945, the first wave learned the lesson in a single second. The most dangerous islands are the ones that look quiet. When the volcano inhales, the fortress is only making ready to speak. The blueprint of a volcano fortress began with a geologic map. Engineers traced the island as bones, layers of consolidated ash that could be carved with pick and drill flows of hardened basalt that deflected tunnels like stubborn grain in wood pockets, where sulfur gas gathered and burned the throat. The work proceeded like surgery. First, the portals, cut into cliffs on the reverse slope where naval guns could not see them. Then the galleries, arcing to connect pillboxes and command posts, built in chokes and bends, so a blast might spend itself before it learned how to travel. Vertical shafts for error and observation, disguised under thatch and stones. Sumps in the floor where condensation pooled. Pumps to push it back up when the sea pushed down. On Iwo Jima, crews hollowed Suribachi until its insides were a hive, and then reached east into the island's waist, sewing together positions into a lattice that crossed itself at inconvenient angles, interlocking fields of fire, machine guns that could stitch the ground between them, mortar that dropped their warnings onto any straight-line men tried to form. There were gun casemates poured in concrete, their embrasures masked by screens and stones. There were cannon hauled into caves just big enough to exhale them, barrels hidden behind doors that swung aside like pieces of cliff. There were stepping stone niches built into tunnel walls for couriers to leap past litters and ammunition carts by candlelight. Kuribayashi's telephone system reached nearly everywhere. In the day, he could fight with wires. At night, runners carried orders between caverns like nerves. The mountain was a house with rooms the attacker must visit in sequence. Here, an anti-tank gun at the mouth of a draw. There, a 320mm spigot mortar tucked into a scooped-out grotto, lobbing its great concussion bombs with a noise like a barn collapsing. Scattered in the folds, small mutually supporting nests type 96 machine guns, 47mm anti-tank guns, mortar lined in crescents that fired, then slid back behind screens of rock. Many of the positions looked empty until you woke them with your presence. In Rabaul, the cave city was older, grander, and different. The caldera offered depth like lavish wealth. Caverns widened into rivers of shadow where trucks and field kitchens sat out the storm of bombs. Workshops thrummed under the mountains. X-ray machines lit ghostly bones in underground wards. Ammunition magazines sat in cold rooms beneath a world that rumbled day and night. In the jungle above, the green roof disguised the works until it erupted in sudden white blast patterns trailed by smoke. From Chichi Jima to Paramushir, the method echoed. Take a volcanic island's advantages and multiply them. Reinforce the parts that nature left soft with concrete and timber. Leave the parts that nature made hard as your shield. Create false positions to drink the enemy's first rush of fire, and keep the true heart quiet until it bruises something vital. Camouflage became a discipline unto itself, shaved volcanic ash mixed with binder and brushed over concrete to mimic tough. Screens woven from coconut fronds and wire, barrels and beams scarred to match the palette of baked rock. From the sea, a cliff was a cliff. To the man who had memorized its pox, it was a cupboard with guns inside. Heat complicated mercy and made existence a calculation. Sulfur vents belched low in some galleries. Hydrogen sulfide pooled heavier than air in others, sweet and deadly. Ventilation fathers cranked by hand, powered by improvised motors, louvered to keep the rain out hauled in wind. The air arrived warm and dusty, bare good enough at the best of times. The smell lived in uniforms. Water condensed on the ceiling and dripped, constant, a second clock that measured days and damp. Mold blossomed on bamboo stretchers and rice sacks. The rice itself clumped and grew sour. In the swelter, men learned to sleep without comfort. Where the rock yielded easily, the work went fast. Where it held, the work took skin. The price did not show up on any order of battle. Korean laborers drilled and shoveled and hauled. So did conscripted Okinawans and Japanese soldiers who learned the weight of a shovel as a military discipline. Cave-ins took them. So did disease, heat, and tunneling gas. The dead left their shadows on the walls where torches burned close. In the fortress logic of the islands, such deaths were invisible. The only measure of whether a tunnel-less life was worth, it was whether it endured enough bombardments to let a gun speak when it mattered. Guns spoke often. Naval guns threw punctuation at the islands for days at a time. Bombers hammered the slopes with avalanches of explosive consonants. The islands learned to endure the language, and then, after, to whisper back. A fort beneath a mountain is mostly a vault. Its creatures survive the initial storm, and then emerge to speak in short, sharp sentences. A mortar's drop. A sniper's two-beat punctuation. The scything paragraph of a machine gun. The places from which those sentences were spoken were chosen in advance by men who walked the ground and imagined an enemy's sideline, then stepped past it and placed the gun where that sideline failed. Because nothing is absolute, there were always surfaces in the deep. Where tunnels reached out toward air, they became vulnerable. Where bands of ash were thin, shells found them and pushed shock into the brain of the mountain. Where roads cut across reverse slopes, a destroyer's 5-inch guns could rake them end to end, as cruelly accurate as a schoolteacher's red pen. The answer, over and over, was to disappear and let the island absorb the blow. The plan rested on the strange arithmetic of volcanic war, that once the enemy set his boots on your ash, you could burn his time faster than he could replenish it. The calendar mattered as much as the map. By late 1944, with the Marianas lost and the Central Pacific Drive pressing, Japan knew the United States could absorb losses that would stagger any other nation. The Fortress Islands had to distort American calculations. They had to make commanders weigh each step and think of what waited at war as an invasion of Kyushu, then Honshu against a ledger already full of names. Volcanoes were chosen not because they loved war, but because they made death expensive. No fortress. The first hours on Iwo Jima felt like a fever dream no one recalled asking for. Amtraks lurched onto beaches that crawled like a living thing. Black sand swallowing tracks and boots, while machine gun bullets came from angles that made no sense. The silence had been bluff. The island's breath held under the press of naval bombardment. Now it exhaled. In the distance, Mount Suribachi waited, a low cone like the back of a sleeping beast. From its flanks, hidden mouths spoke. Marines learned the grammar of the fortress in minutes. There were no neat lines to press back with one heroic push. You could knock out a pillbox and find that it was just a note in a larger chord. The real music interlocking fire continued, played from a ravine or a slope you hadn't noticed. The black sand drained strength from legs and resolve from minds. When the order to move came, your body argued with the ground, and the ground won. Flamethrowers became words that could pry open sealed paragraphs. Men surged forward behind tanks and engineers, the blowtorch and the satchel charge working together in a brutal conversation with stone. Concrete burned when approached correctly. Air heated, then ignited inside the bunker. Somewhere behind smoke and noise, defenders screamed and coughed and fired until their gun was a glowing finger. When the flames stopped, the silence felt older. The tunnels made the island seem immortal. A bunker stomped flat at noon could fire again at dusk. Men you were sure had died vanished into the mountain and materialized later to cut diagonally across your world with a string of grenades. At night, infiltrators rose from ventilation shafts like difficult thoughts. They crept along the edges of foxholes. Bayonets whispered. The island designed these moments. On the southern tip, beneath Suribachi's brow, a war of rooms unfolded. Outcrop by outcrop, cave mouth by cave mouth, Marines climbed with grenades in their teeth, or crawled with a coil of demolition cord over a shoulder. Progress wasn't measured in yards, but in vents taken, embrasures silenced, a particular bend in a tunnel now behind you. The mountain had hallways, switchbacks, angles that taught men why geometry could save your life. It had internal weather-stale heat, damp air that slowed thought and amplified fear. On the days when they looked up, they saw planes drawing marker trails across the blue, then diving to stitch Suribachi's slope with rocket fire. Somewhere far behind them, an artilleryman scratched a mark and adjusted the angle a degree or two. A shell arced and found basalt. The basalt shook its head and refused to break the way the man wanted. In the north, away from Suribachi, the island's waist narrowed, then spread like a clenched knuckle. Here, Kuribayashi's plan was most perfect. There was no single line to breach, only a deep rug of positions you had to step through until something under your foot refused to be flattened. Marines and soldiers found themselves in a maze without walls, guided against their will by gullies and shallow ravines that emptied into death. Bunkers sat beside family tombs. The island carried its dead into new centuries without consent, and a fight made a third landscape out of the two, one where men crouched behind the same stone for opposite reasons at different hours. The fortress was not just the island's fortress. It was a concept that reached up into the air. At stake was not a symbol, but a lane. Iwo Jima sat halfway between the Marianas and Tokyo, the perfect stepping stone for fighters and a potential relay for radar and air-sea rescue. Already, American B-29s droned toward Honshu with bellies full of bombs and engines that could fail. In the weeks after the island fell more than 2,000, superfortresses would divert to Iwo, some on 3 engines, some trailing smoke. Many kept from writing their names on the sea by the hard gift of a volcanic runway that had cost so much to level and hold. The pilots would peer down at the black scar in the Pacific and whisper thanks to men they never met. Casualties lengthened and thickened like shadows near twilight. Kuribayashi refused to spend his garrison in a single theatrical act. He spent them instead in smaller, focused withdrawals and replies, refusing the great shout in favor of 1,000 knife-sharp whispers. He wrote to his family about cherry blossoms and duty. He kept the phone lines alive as long as he could. When his headquarters finally went dark, the silence that replaced his voice felt like a new phase of the island rather than an ending. The flag on Suribachi went up, and a camera caught it twice once in a moment that looked too neat, then again in a frame that would outlive the men who raised it. But the mountain was only the island's chin. The rest of the face still fought. The image returned to America as proof of triumph. The men on the ground knew better. They had weeks left to learn what an enemy can do when he has a mountain to disappear into, and orders to never leave. Beyond Iwo Jima, the idea continued to test the Allies. In the Aleutians, Attu turned valleys into charnel houses, fog into a weapon, hills into a series of close-run ruins where Japanese soldiers died in the last massed banzai charge of the war's northern theater. In Kiska's case, the fortress tricked its enemy into bombarding ghosts. The garrison slipped away one night under fog and cloud, leaving wired positions and empty tunnels to keep up appearances. On Paramushir and Shimushu, garrisons dug and waited, braced for a clash that would only arrive when another empire, the Soviet Union, crossed the water in August 1945. But in the central eye of the war's camera, Iwo Jima showed the purest version of a principle, that a volcano can be taught to fight. It will demand everything in exchange: labor, cleverness, the lives of those who build it, the sanity of those who defend it, and the blood of the men sent to break it. On its slopes and in its rooms, that price was paid. When the battle ended, Kuribayashi himself vanished into the logic of his design. His body was never conclusively found. It was as if the mountain chose to keep him, an architect sealed inside the property he made. Volcano fortresses changed the shape of Allied strategy, sometimes by provocation, sometimes by demonstration. Rabaul demanded an answer in 1943. It had swelled into a dark star, a fortress swelling with divisions and gun, batteries and planes that leapt from airfields cut into fresh lava. To hurl Marines and soldiers into that caldera would have been to draft an obituary for a generation. The answer was to refuse the mountain's terms. Operation Cartwheel turned around it. Airfields were seized at the periphery: New Georgia, Bougainville, and their circles of influence widened like ripples in a basin. Air power squeezed Rabaul's throat. Navy patrols pinched its roots. The fortress remained, but as a predator put behind bars. More than 100,000 men waded through the war's final years in a volcano that had ceased to be a weapon and become a pantry with a locked door. Elsewhere, the Japanese pushed underground again, beneath volcanoes and hills in the home islands. The thought of an American invasion Operation Downfall made tunnels bloom like night flowers. In Kyushu's volcanic ridges and Shikoku's cliffs, cave mouths multiplied. Aircraft were pulled off open airfields and hidden in carved galleries called kiko-ana plain caves, where mechanics worked by lamplight and pilots memorized footpaths between lava and brush. Around the cone of Sakurajima and down Kagoshima Bay, the shoreline bristled where the rock would yield to chisels. Beach defenses stepped back. Planners wrote equations using caverns and suicide boats, spigot mortar and concealed gun pits, and imagined a battle that would teach the invader a sum he might refuse to solve. In Nagano, hundreds of miles from salt air, another fortress grew in stone, the Matsushiro Underground Imperial Headquarters, a network cut under MT, Maizuru and neighboring hills for a last-ditch relocation of the emperor and the nerve centers of the state. Over 10 kilometers of tunnels were bored and shored with timbers and concrete by conscripted labor, including thousands of Koreans taken under duress into a world of dust and heat. The galleries were never finished. They remain now as a cutaway of intent, a fossil of what the state planned when it thought it might need to live indefinitely under the earth. On Chichi Jima, black volcanic headlands sheltered radio stations and guns capable of watching the lanes north of Iwo Jima. Its cliffs hid caves filled with food and munitions. Its bays were nets for barges that ran at night. American forces hit it from the air and sea, but never mounted an invasion. The island's coral and basalt drank 1,000 small violences and kept its garrison intact until the war went dark like a lamp. Even when the geology changed, the logic held. On Okinawa, the ridges and escarpments were coral and limestone sculpted by weather, not lava. Yet the defensive rhyme was the same. Reverse slope positions, caves linked by tunnels, pillboxes masked as rock. The island did not need a volcano's heat to become a fortress. It borrowed the volcano's habit of inwardness. The Shuri line took the volcano's lesson. Disappear, wait, punish, and recited it back under monsoon skies. Against this mountain logic, the United States crafted its own language. Naval gunfire learned to sweep not just beaches, but reverse slopes and arcing patterns. Tanks grew flamethrower snouts and learned to work cordoned with engineer teams. The blowtorch and corkscrew method repeated until it felt like a grim catechism. Infantry carried satchel charges and demolition cord as routinely as cigarettes. The Pacific War became a seminar in geology. Coral that shatters like glass in slices. Limestone that yields caves. Volcanic tuff that takes a tunnel like a welcoming host and then tries to smother you with heat and fumes. The volcanoes themselves kept a longer memory. Rabaul's caldera erupted again in 1994, long after the gun barrels rusted, covering the town with ash like a second war. On Iwo Jima, renamed E2, the old reading of its characters recovered after the war. The ground still steams. Suribachi rises with its ancient shrug. The tunnels remain, collapsed in places, intact in others. A honeycomb that once held men and now holds only displaced air and echo. Bones surface after storms. The island remains largely closed, a garrison base and a memorial. A place where volcanic breath and human history are layered thinly over each other like glass and soot. The volcano fortress ate more than stones. It ate labor, time, and secrecy. It asked that men accept a form of war that took place mostly without sky. For defenders, it offered a promise. If you surrender to me, I will make you hard to kill. For attackers, it delivered a sentence. If you move quickly, you will die. If you move slowly, you will die more cleverly. The calculus influenced decisions in rooms far from the smell of sulfur. When planners measured Iwo's cost, Okinawa's bill, Rabaul's containment, and calculated Kyushu's future, they tallied not just losses, but what it meant to fight a land that could close around you. The volcano was not only a fortress in stone, it was a fortress in the mind. If there is a surprise in this story, it is how often the fortress controlled events without firing a shot. Rabaul undone by encirclement. Kiska defending an absence with fog. Chichi Jima holding positions that never faced an amphibious landing. Fortresses unmet become myths, their power amplified by what we choose not to test. The Japanese command built them as declarations of will. Allied planners studied them as lessons in avoidance. And in the end, even the fortresses that were tested caught the same lesson about modern war's drift toward the subterranean. When the sky is owned by someone else, the earth becomes your only ally. To see how completely Japan understood that truth, one need only stand in a tunnel lit by a single bulb. When the guns stopped, the volcanoes remained. They outlived the banners and the batteries, and the languages of order. On E2, the black sand still clutches ankles. On the ridges above Rabaul, roots plow through old timber shoring and mingle with rusted rails. In Matsushiro's galleries, visitors walk in a dry cool that once seared throats and burned lungs. The fortresses, emptied of purpose, became museums of intention. They ask their questions quietly, because they have no other way to speak. How Japan turned volcanoes into fortresses was, in one light, an engineering achievement improvisation under pressure, a deep understanding of terrain, a willingness to stand logic on its head and make defense less visible and more lethal. It took science and sweat to drill through scoria without collapsing your own roof. It took organization to wire a mountain so that one voice could travel where sunlight could not. It took courage to live within stone and wait, to measure your days in condensation drips in air, filtered through charcoal and cloth. In another light, it was a tragedy technology and will in service of a cause already lost to arithmetic. The tunnels bought time. They bought pride. They did not change the outcome. They did, however, change the terms by which that outcome was reached. They made the cost of taking certain islands a headline even the invulnerable noticed. They turned questions about a future invasion into debates that had to include words like Iwo and Okinawa and Rabaul as evidence. They taught a generation of leaders that some gates might be opened by walking around them, others only by burning your hands on the iron. For those who dug and those who stormed, the metaphor of volcanoes holds after the history books close. The heat stays in the skin for years. Veterans remembered the smell of sulfur and hot rope, the taste of ash that got into food and prayer. Some remembered tunnel darkness more intimately than they remembered daylight. Some could not speak about what it meant to torch a cave, knowing that inside, behind the muzzle flashes, lay men, and perhaps people who had never worn a uniform, folded into the folds of a mountain they could not leave. Others remembered the relief in the eyes of a defender who crawled out dusty and shaking with hands raised, because sometimes the fortress cracked and mercy made it through. The islands speak now in stone and ceremony. On Itu's heights, markers stand where cameras once did, as if to say that an image can be both true and incomplete. At Rabaul, the ash from 1994 sits like an ironic second layer of history on the old emplacements. Nature and war, sharing a trick of covering in revelation. In Nagano, the Matsushiro tunnels remain raw, a system that leads to chambers that never heard the voices they were built to receive. The Kurils and the Aleutians stand under weather that erases footprints in an hour. There is a quiet call embedded in their persistence. It is not to worship fortresses or the ingenuity that made them, nor to pretend that stones alone shape decisions. It is to learn how completely the ground under our feet can be drafted into our arguments, and to recognize what we spend when we ask it to help us fight. Volcanoes do not choose sides. They provide possibilities. We choose whether to make them rooms for suffering or places where we tell stories about what suffering taught us to avoid. In that choice sits the legacy of a strategy. Kuribayashi understood that a volcano is a paradox. It is a place that is alive, and yet not. A thing that endures and can kill you simply by being. He strapped guns to that truth and wired it with discipline. We can look at what he built and see either a testament to resolve or a tomb arranged with genius. Both are true. The better use of such truth is to examine our own obsessions with impregnable defenses, with burrowing in, with equating endurance with wisdom. The volcanic fortresses helped end a way of fighting even as they defined it. They forced the war to consider the earth as a participant, not a passive stage. Then they were left behind, to cool and to steam, to be walked through by school children and veterans, by those who seek to feel a history in their breathing. The earth keeps its own counsels. It remembers by erasing and by revealing. That we can enter the old galleries and feel an island exhale is a grace we should accept carefully. Perhaps the image that best answers the question of how volcanoes became fortresses is not a gun port in Tough, or a flamethrower's tongue in a dark cave. It is a runway scratched into ash, where a bomber with 3 engines limps down and makes it home because men cut into a mountain and held it long enough. Or it is a caldera ringed with gun pits that never saw an assault, because someone decided that to fight a mountain is not always the best way to win. Between those images lies a lesson. Make the earth a weapon if you must, but listen to what it asks in payment, and weigh that cost against your purpose. The last sound is a small one. Water falling from a tunnel ceiling, drip by drip, the rhythm of patience. It counted hours for men underground, marked the time between bombardments, soothed and irritated to equal degree. It keeps counting now. If we are wise, we count with it. The pulses of decisions, the space where skill becomes sacrifice, the moments when history asks us to enter the mountain or to walk away. That is how volcanoes became fortresses. That is how we decide what to make of them after the fires go out.